story. It was Palm Sunday, and little Johnny was not feeling well. That poor little Johnny, he was not feeling good, so he stayed home from church. And afterwards, his family came home, and they all had these palm branches that they got during church service. And Johnny was curious. He says, well, what are those for? And his father explained to him, well, it's in honor of Palm Sunday. And what happened was that all the people would wave these palm branches and even take some of their coats off and lay it on the ground as Jesus walked through the middle of all the people. And Johnny thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. Are you kidding me? The one day I don't go to church on Sunday, and Jesus finally showed up. All right. So, Oikonomics. 40 Days of Oikonomics. We actually started this a few weeks back, and this time kind of leading up till Easter. This time, even culturally, even still to this day, we understand that our culture seems to be more and more kind of against church and less Christian, if you will. But during the Easter season, people are still rather open to spiritual conversations and maybe attending church or participating in certain activities or opportunities that the season provides. And so as we're kind of running into this celebration of Resurrection Sunday, we're recognizing that as an opportunity when we can share our faith with others at a time that maybe they might be open. And so how can we do that? How do we share our faith? And we've been looking at just some simple ideas of what we can do, but ultimately taking and using the resources that God has entrusted to us to make a difference in the world. Oikonomics is a kind of a mashed up word, but of two kind of ideas. One is oikos, which really means your family or your extended family. And nomics or economics would be the idea of law and administration. The Bible uses the word, actually, oikonomos, which anytime you see the word in the Bible, stewardship, it's using some form of that word, oikonomos. And it just means that we are called to manage the resources that God has entrusted to us and use them wisely in our household and in our families, and then take that and after we've used our resources wisely, we use them to make a difference in the world. But we're not just talking about giving money. That's not what it's really about. We've looked so far at many different things and looked at there's 5 different capitals that we need to manage and then use well and wisely in the world around us. The first week we talked about spiritual capital. How can you invest your wisdom and power in your daily life? And we said that wisdom is power, whereas those seem like really big words. I don't know that I'm really all that smart. I don't know that I know that much. I don't know that I've got like the power of God shooting from my fingertips. Wisdom and power, what are you talking about? And we said, well, really what it's about is that you learn how to hear the word of Jesus, the guidance of Jesus. We listen to that, which is the wisdom by which we manage our lives, and then we follow and obey him. And when God begins to work in us and change us and move in us, the people around us see that we are living a transformed life, and that is powerful. The second thing Grayson talked about last week was our physical capital, that you have time and energy to manage and use wisely so that you are using a portion of your time and a portion of your energy for kingdom purposes. In fact, the great theologian, Grayson Culver, said just last week, what we do with our time and energy reveals our love for God. I thought that was a powerful statement. Look over your calendar and ask yourself, how much of your time are you using for God and to be with God and to serve God and to do his work in the world around you? How we use our time and energy reveals how we love him, or at least something about it. Okay, this week we're going to talk about relational capital, which is how do we build equity with our family and friends. And then the last two are going to be financial and intellectual. Now, why is all this important? Well, because there's a world around us that is walking through life in utter darkness. Remember our theme verse, John 12:46. And let's just put it up there. I'll say it once, and I'd like us to say it together again. I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. That Jesus has come to this world, and we've unpacked this a little each week, this idea that as he brings light into the world, we don't have to walk in darkness. We can walk in his light. And some of us might know what it's like, or maybe we've been there, and we've been in that darkness. And then Jesus Christ illuminated the path for us. Let's say it together. John 12:46, I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. December 31st, 2015. A man by the name of Jonathan Izard was driving home down a lonely country road. It wasn't very late, just a little bit after 5 p.m., but this is December and it was wintertime, and night had completely settled in and the road was very dark. It was pitch black out. There was no other traffic. He was not in a hurry to get home. He'd gotten off work, he'd stopped for a bite to eat, and now he was just making his way back to spend the rest of the evening and, next to a cozy fire and a good book. He wasn't distracted he hadn't been drinking, he wasn't on his cell phone, he had nothing to impair his way. All he knows, and it's completely unexplainable, but in an instant, a face suddenly emerged in his windshield. Jonathan struck another human man with his car. And Michael Rawson laid on the ground, clinging to life, later dying in the hospital 6 days later. This is now a little over 3 years ago. Jonathan is still trying to come to grips with how this horrific accident happened and how he gets to go on with his life when another man doesn't. I've been reading his story a little bit. It's powerful and it's pretty amazing to find healing for himself. He's determined that what he wants to do is go around and learn more about the life of the man he took, his life that he took. He's meeting his wife. He's walked through his home. He's spent time with his family. He's met some of his friends. He's asked, what was he like? What did he do? What was important to him? Sometimes there are things that happen in the darkness that will change a person's life forever. We previously mentioned some kind of, seemingly insignificant or proportionately insignificant things that happen in the darkness. How we've maybe stumbled over a box or a cushion or something on the floor in the middle of the night. How you've maybe stubbed a toe or stepped on a toy. These things are insignificant, really. There are other things that happen in the darkness that destroy happiness. They're desperately evil, and sometimes even take away life itself. The darkness is serious and it's looming and it can take in and it invades. Even in the life of a Christ follower, when we have moments of weakness or moments of when we let our guard down or we let the darkness rule in our life and in our heart, so much damage can happen. I know that even in this room, the darkness has impacted you, and it wasn't necessarily your fault. You don't know how that face flashed suddenly in front of your windscreen. All you know is that there's pain because of tragedy that's come, or that things that are happened in the darkness of your life, and it just altered your reality and your future forever. But the good news is that where darkness tries to hide, the light can bring healing and hope. When darkness seeks to destroy, Jesus can restore. When the darkness is meant for evil, God can turn it around and even use that for good. And that's the light that is entrusted to us to illuminate and share with the world that's around us. God wants to bring light into your life, and when you're walking in the light of Jesus Christ, you can help illuminate the world around you with God's love and God's leading and God's life. We get to bring that into the world if we manage our resources well. And today we're talking about relationship capital. To do this, I want to talk about Luke chapter 19, if you want to start looking there. Perhaps it's a familiar story, but I've really enjoyed kind of revisiting this personally this week and discovered some things I hadn't considered before. It's the story of Zacchaeus and his encounter with Jesus in Luke chapter 19. And we'll take a look at the story. We'll read it, and then we'll kind of go back through it and unpack a few ideas and thoughts. Luke chapter 19, beginning with verse 1. He entered Jericho and was passing through. This is Jesus. He's entered Jericho and passing through. And may I just point out, because I won't revisit this, that this being Palm Sunday, it's hard to determine exactly when this story happened in relationship to Palm Sunday. But this is kind of one of the last recorded events before Palm Sunday. After this, and it could be just a day or maybe a couple of days. Chapter 19 just kind of reads through as almost a continuous story. From here, he ends up in Bethany with his friends, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. He spends the night with them, and then Sunday morning, he goes and enters into Jerusalem. Okay, so this is just days before, and maybe even hours. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich, and he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." And so he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, this is a crowd of people that are watching this happen, they all grumbled. "He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, and so he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So let's think about a couple things about Zacchaeus and look at him first. Who is this guy? Well, we know from the text a couple things. First of all, he was a tax collector. Now, in that day, tax collectors were Jews who were hired by the Romans to collect the taxes. Perhaps it might be more accurate to say they were hired by the Romans to extract the taxes. This means that the Jews didn't like them because they were, they were Jews, but now they're doing what they saw as such an evil thing, a difficult thing, a tough thing. And so the Jews didn't like Zacchaeus, but he really wasn't a Roman citizen either. He worked for them, but he wasn't a part of them and did not enjoy being a part of their nation or their protections or being a part of the community. And so the Jews and the Romans both would have rejected and exiled Zacchaeus from their community. And so they didn't belong to anyone. They didn't belong anywhere. They just existed to extract taxes. Now, during the Sermon on the Mount, even Jesus called out a tax collector as despised and unscrupulous. He said, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? He said, that's an easy thing to do. Loving people that already love you is easy. And what was his example? Even the tax collectors can do this. Jesus himself is almost saying, even the lowest of the low of society, even the worst of the worst can do good when it's easy. And that's the way they were thought of. Tax collectors were not only shunned, not only despised and rejected, but hated and mocked and pushed out of all things of society. Now, Zacchaeus was not only a tax collector, but it said he was a chief tax collector. You know, this is the only time in the Bible that this is even mentioned. And as I was doing just some very preliminary research, it seems like even historically, we don't have a lot of information about what a chief tax collector is. And so we can only make a certain assumption, and I don't think it's hard to assume this, that he was a manager of other tax collectors. He was a guy who was probably responsible for training and reporting on and collecting the taxes from them. So this guy's not only a tax collector, but he's in charge of all the other tax collectors. And what I'd like you to think about as we consider who Zacchaeus was is layers of separation from society. The fact that he rejects his Jewish heritage to become a tax collector is a layer. The fact that he is a tax collector and everybody hates him is a layer of isolation. The fact that he's not a Roman citizen is a layer. And now we see that he's a manager and trainer and proclaimer of other tax collectors. This is another layer of separation. He just didn't fit in anywhere. And everyone in the community had an even greater reason just to hate him, and to look at him, and to make fun of him, and to chastise him, and to isolate Zacchaeus from everybody else. But then it also says that he was rich. What a dirty word. I hope none of you are ever afflicted. Yeah. I'm sure a few of you are safe to never be afflicted with wealth. You know, and I was thinking about this. This is kind of my little addition here. I don't have any empirical data on this, just a simple observation from my humble view. But it seems like poor people love to hate rich people. You know, for whatever reason, sometimes it's jealousy. I think sometimes they deserved it. But in this case, tax collectors made their money not from the collecting of the taxes that would be then given to the Roman Empire, or really the way they made their extra money was by collecting excessive taxes. They would get a wage for what they did, but if they could find ways to come up with fines and penalties and overages and just charge more. And they had the might and the power of the entire Roman government behind them to do it, to take the money, to take the taxes that they wanted. And because the way they got kind of their extra money was extracting, it was just another reason for everybody to hate him. But Zacchaeus was so good at doing this, he's actually pointed out as being rich off of the extortion, the legalized extortion of everybody else. You know, how much do we complain about paying? We were in the office this morning. There was 3 of us in the office this morning complaining about taxes. The church got hit with a new tax. Okay, get this. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but occasionally when you buy things online, if you buy them from out of state, you don't have to pay tax. But that changed. That just changed, and I'm not sure. It seems like it was at least enacted this year or something. Maybe it started last year. I don't know. So now if you buy something online, it doesn't matter where it is, you have to pay tax on that. So we got notification last year that we have to pay a use tax on something we purchased last year. It was the partitions, the bathroom stalls that we bought for the men's bathroom downstairs. So now the government seems to assume that we're using the bathroom, and we have to pay a use tax on the partitions that we bought. And so we had to pay like this $90 tax because we didn't pay for it when this law changed or whatever. And that started a whole conversation about paying taxes and how much taxes are, and we hate taxes and blah, blah, blah. Well, think about somebody that can come in and take whatever taxes they want to take to make themselves rich at your expense. Yeah, right. Not much different. Yeah, right. We don't have to think real hard on this one, right? I get it, yeah. And it says Zacchaeus was rich. And everybody saw him, and everybody knew him, and everybody knew how he got his money. There's one more interesting characteristic about Zacchaeus that is always referenced in this story, but I don't think we think much about it. The fact that our text referenced that he was small in stature. He was short. Often I think we read that line, think nothing of it, and move it on like it's kind of a simple description that is really not essential to the story, other than the fact that it's the reason he had to climb a tree to see Jesus. Really no big deal, and maybe it's not. But we can easily accept Zacchaeus' shortness, but when we do, we tend to think of it more as a throwaway statement in the text, just kind of describing this simple Bible character. He's short, no big deal, and so he finds a way to overcome that. But maybe there's more going on. You see, similar to Luke's story, Luke the doctor and his story about the crippled woman in the synagogue, or the man that couldn't walk, or the blind, or the deaf, or other characters that Luke brings out in his stories of how Jesus healed their physical infirmity. Is it possible that Luke here is describing an actual physical disability and just being kind and careful with his words? I think it's easy to accept. Maybe even you would be willing to take my assumption that Zacchaeus was afflicted as a pathological dwarf. It's very possible that he was not just a short man, but we're talking a physically handicapped man by dwarfism. And what's interesting is to look back. In the Greek's language, much like our own, they had words for dwarfism. Researchers have found that there are at least two different descriptors that were used in literature to define somebody who was miniature. There's a word like pygmy, for example. It's almost spelled the way we would spell it. I just don't know how to pronounce it. But it's also been discovered that quite often in literature, when describing people, they would use this word micros, which means small, as a more culturally sensitive way of referring to a person that is small of stature. It was common at that time. It would be their version of being politically correct or humanly sensitive to somebody with a difficulty of this nature, to call them not a pygmy, not a midget, not a dwarf, but to call them somebody who was small in stature. In fact, Amos Young, professor of theology at Regent University in Virginia, writes this: Luke is attempting to communicate or reflect a non-discriminatory bias that literally handicaps readers from engaging the full meaning of the text. I suggest that while it is quite normal for normative interpreters to make little of Zacchaeus' littleness, the dismissal fails to recognize an essential aspect of his humanity and impoverishes our understanding of what is actually going on in this story and in Luke's overall message. When he's saying essentially, if we don't stop and try to grasp the struggles of this man in his life, then we fail to see the glory and the weight and the beauty of what Christ does in the gospel. Now, just to maybe give one more further indication to this, and one more layer. So here, if we can accept maybe that he's a dwarf, a clinical dwarf in stature, but another layer then is to consider, as the crowd does in verse 7, that in that day and age, when a person lived with some kind of physical disability, everyone else looked upon them as a sinner and made the assumption that their disability was inflicted by God as a punishment for what they had done wrong. The Jews often assumed that that God was punishing somebody with physical ailments for sin. John chapter 9, the disciples asked Jesus about a blind man, and they said, Jesus, why is this man blind? Was it because of his sin or his parents? In this case, the crowd looks at Jesus and they're shocked that Zacchaeus was even spoken to, let alone that Jesus wanted to go to his house that day. Why? Because they called him a sinner. How could Jesus stop and talk to a person like this? Why would he want to spend time with a sinner? His sin is so obvious that God has marred the physical attributes of his life by the sin that he has committed. Well, all this just helps us to take a glimpse of the desperation in the story of who Zacchaeus was and how he lived his life each and every day. I mean, even in our culture today, thousands of years later, don't we still look at people of shortness in a different light? Don't we still kind of, gawk and sneer and have a struggle in understanding how to incorporate all people into a society? Well, imagine 2,000 years ago how difficult it was and how they might have treated a man that was a dwarf. Well, second of all, we see Zacchaeus' desperation to see Jesus. He couldn't see him. He wanted to. The text doesn't really explain, at least initially, why, other than he wanted to see him and what all the commotion was about. Because he was so short, he ran on ahead and climbed a sycamore tree. This is what we think of when we think of Zacchaeus in the tree. I mean, actually a fairly normative man. Just out on a limb. Just, hey, no pun intended. He's just sitting out there hanging out, looking around. But think about the context of the story. Think about the scene. Think about what's going on and the commotion and all the people. And Zacchaeus is trying to get a glimpse of Jesus and what's happening. And so what does it say? He ran on ahead. Adult men don't run in that society. They wouldn't run to go anywhere. You don't run. It's indignant. It's inappropriate. But if we could accept again this idea that he's short, possibly even a dwarf, now don't images come to mind of kind of that out of balance little, shortened, improportional body, just trying to make it through the crowd, fighting his way, trying to get ahead. He can barely walk, but he's trying to run to get out to where he wants to be. Grown men don't run. They most certainly do not climb trees. And they absolutely don't climb trees when they're wealthy men trying to impose power and influence over an entire community. But Zacchaeus is so desperate to see Jesus and to see this man and to see if somehow he may have an answer for the pains and the problem in his life. He runs ahead. Dignity is cast to the ground. He doesn't care if he's humiliated. He doesn't care what other people are saying behind his back. He doesn't care what they think about him and what he looks like as he's struggling and fighting. A sycamore tree was chosen because it's an easy tree to climb for a normal person. But Zacchaeus would have been fighting with every tense of the muscle to get up even this little tree and get out to where he could see Jesus pass by. Alexander McLaren wrote, "I wish there were more of us who did not mind being laughed at if only what we did helped us to see Jesus." Zacchaeus didn't care. His reputation, his influence, what it might mean, how he might look. He just knew he needed a glimpse of this man and what it might mean to his life. And so his dignity was cast aside. And he was at the end of his rope, and this was maybe his last chance. So how did Jesus respond? Well, Jesus responds with compassion and relationship. And this is kind of the more popular part of the story, I think, once we just kind of throw away the fact that Jesus was a little guy in a tree. We see in verse 5, he says, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Well, what's Jesus doing? It's kind of convenient of Jesus to invite himself over for dinner. I've kind of been thinking, who wants to feed me today? I'm going to be hungry here in a little bit. Maybe I'll invite myself over. But Zacchaeus, was desperate to see Jesus, and he was desperate with, casting aside his dignity and hoping beyond hope that maybe Jesus would have an answer for him. And Jesus spotted this. Jesus saw him. He stood out. That's the reason he's in the tree. And Jesus thought, if here's a guy, if he is so desperate to see me, then I am desperate to see him. I am ready to be with him. And he wasn't going to wait another moment. He says, "Zacchaeus, hurry down. Come down quickly. And I'm going to leave the crowd. Okay, I'm going to leave my team. I'm going to get away from this." Jesus could have thought, here's a chance for miracles. I'm going to do a bunch of more things. Here's a chance to feed this crowd. I've done it before. Let's do it again. And let's feed them and demonstrate and show them, that I am the Messiah. And they would believe in me again. Or he might sit them all down outside of town and have them sit in a grassy field and climb up onto a little rock where he could start teaching what he wanted them to know. There's so much that he could have done that would seem to have more impact for God's kingdom by our standards, by our human view. But what does Jesus do? He leaves the crowd. He's not interested in the applause. He doesn't want the fame and the accolations and all that. Yes, I want to set aside my afternoon and go to your house and spend it with you. That's the Jesus that we have. When we say, "Jesus, I want to see you," he says, "I want to see you too." The Bible says that salvation came to the house of Zacchaeus that day. He was a changed and a transformed man. There's no indication that Jesus really taught him anything. There's no indication Jesus told him to do anything on his own, just because Jesus spent time with this man who was so desperate for acceptance. And he gave him some relationship that Zacchaeus on his own said, "I'm going to give half of all I own to the poor. And anybody I've cheated, I'm going to go back through my records. I'm going to make everything right that I can. And I'll pay back even more what I took." Now, think about that transformation and how simple Jesus' part was, at least in that story. All he needed to do was spend time with a man who was in pain and was in desperation. And I want to suggest to you that this is how we can make a difference in the world, is by giving people relationship. and just saying, I care about you and I want to spend time with you. I have a graph up here. Consider proximity and purpose as a way to make an impact in people's lives. Proximity is about relationship and spending time with and being near people. We need to be with them and investing ourselves in their lives. And then we need to think about purpose. It's not just about being there. It's not just coffee. It's not just eating sandwiches over lunch. But Jesus had a purpose. He said at the end of his story, I have come with purpose. I'm scrolling back to find out what he says. He says, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. He didn't say the Son of Man has come to have lunch with Zacchaeus. But he used that lunch for a purpose. And he wanted to be in proximity with Zacchaeus and then bring hope to Zacchaeus' house. And so this is a matrix for us to consider. What does it look like to have high proximity and high purpose as we live our lives in relationship? And we can go through this real quickly. The first one is, what does it look like if we have low proximity and low purpose in our lives? We call that apathy. This is when we don't care about people and we don't care about the mission of Jesus. And it's easy to do. We're busy. We have our own needs and our own struggles. We have our own wants and our own desires. And we can just not take the time to be around people that are hurting and struggling or isolated or lonely. We might be afraid that we don't have the energy or we don't have the ability ourselves to make a difference. And we isolate and insulate and we're just apathetic towards their needs. We look the other way. What does it look like if we have high proximity but low purpose? This is the way a lot of us, I think, hope that we share our faith with others through osmosis. We connect with people and we hope that they'll just kind of pick up the fact that Jesus is with us. That it might just kind of rub off on them a little bit. They might smell him on us somehow. And that through osmosis, it'll just kind of happen. And maybe we don't take the time. We don't bring it up. We don't know how to maybe just wiggle a little something about our faith into a conversation or a time that we spend with somebody else. Now, I'm not talking about this next one. What does it look like to have low proximity but high purpose? We see this all the time because it's so overt. But we call it coercion. It's trying to play on people's fears and shames to give them kind of a spiritual arm twisting. I've been open that I really don't support this kind of evangelism because I don't think it works. I don't think anybody's listening anymore. Our culture has really shifted a lot. There is no missionary in the world that is effective that uses this kind of evangelism, thinking that they can change people's lives without knowing them first. It might have an early acceptance, but it just doesn't seem to be lasting in true change and lifelong relationship with Jesus Christ. I think we need to know the story of the gospel. I think we need to know that we are called to preach and to teach and to tell people with purpose. But if we don't have proximity in people's lives, if we haven't earned that voice, I just don't think it makes much impact or difference. And I don't think we're effective when we try to argue people into the kingdom or coerce them into believing what we believe. And so we look at what Jesus did. We look at how Jesus offered salvation. High proximity and high purpose. And he spent the afternoon with a guy that nobody believed he should be with. And he went to Zacchaeus' house. And he says, Zacchaeus, I find you interesting. I find you important. I find that you're a guy I want to spend time with. And Jesus is an important guy. Can you imagine thinking that somebody that's making that much of a difference in the city would kind of give up some of their time to spend it with you? However we might contextualize that, who's our heroes? Who are the people that we kind of look to? Who are the people that we think are just amazing? Could you imagine if they kind of got away from the crowd and suddenly said, when you don't know them, they'd like to spend time with you? So Jesus offers proximity and relationship, but he goes there with a purpose. And Jesus spends his time with Zacchaeus. Without this distinction, without recognizing that we need to spend time invested in people's lives and time on mission in their lives, living an incarnational lifestyle like Jesus did. Without this distinction, there's nothing to call people to, and without the connection, there's no people to call at all. So what does it look like? How can we simply find ways to just go to lunch with a non-believer? To send a card, to make a phone call, to invite over to your house and say, I'd like to spend some time with you, and see what Jesus does. Let's pray. Father, we just give you thanks.